People said Judge Eleanor Hawthorne had never hesitated, not once. In 15 years on the bench, she had built a reputation that traveled faster than her rulings. Attorneys warned their clients about her before trial. Defendants learned her name long before they ever heard a verdict. She was precise, controlled, unmoved by tears. Justice to her was not a feeling, it was a structure. Clean lines, clear consequences, no room for sentiment. That morning, the courtroom was already full when she entered. Everyone stood. The sound echoed, chairs scraping, fabric shifting, breath held. Eleanor didn't acknowledge it. She never did. Respect, she believed, didn't need recognition. It existed whether you nodded back or not. She took her seat, adjusted her robe once, and looked down at the docket. Case after case passed through her courtroom like clockwork. Assault, fraud, possession, each one resolved with the same calm efficiency. She listened, she weighed evidence, she ruled. No drama, no speeches. By noon, her voice was hoarse, but her expression hadn't changed. Then they called the next case. The bailiff announced the name, and Eleanor lifted her eyes for the first time in minutes. That was when she saw her. The woman stood at the defense table, hands folded, posture straight but not defiant. She didn't look afraid in the way Eleanor was used to seeing. No shaking, no pleading eyes scanning the room for mercy. She looked composed, too composed for someone facing a life-altering verdict. Eleanor noted it automatically, the way she catalogued everything. Appearance, demeanor, body language, a habit honed over years. The woman appeared to be in her early 30s, dark hair pulled back neatly, simple clothes, clean, modest, intentional, no jewelry except a thin chain at her neck. Her face carried something Eleanor couldn't immediately name. Not guilt, not arrogance, something quieter. The prosecutor began laying out the charges. The words were familiar. Eleanor had heard them hundreds of times. Circumstances, evidence, statutes, mandatory minimums. On paper, the case was simple. The woman had interfered in a violent incident. A man had been injured. The law didn't care why she had stepped in. It cared that she had. Eleanor listened, pen moving across her notes with practiced speed. Then the defense stood. They didn't paint the woman as a hero. They didn't dramatize. They didn't beg. They told the story plainly. Late hour, empty street, a scream that cut through silence, a decision made in seconds, a body moving before the mind could calculate consequence. Eleanor felt it then. Not sympathy, discomfort. She dismissed it immediately. Discomfort was irrelevant. The woman was called to testify. She stepped forward calmly, raised her hand, and swore the oath without hesitation. When she spoke, her voice didn't shake. "I didn't think," she said. "I just acted." Eleanor watched her closely. "Why?" the prosecutor pressed. The woman paused, just briefly. "Because someone was going to die." The courtroom was silent. Not the dramatic kind of silence that followed outbursts, the heavy kind, the kind that sat on the chest. Eleanor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Intent didn't change outcomes. That was the law. She reminded herself of that as the testimony concluded, as arguments were wrapped, as the room waited for her words. When she delivered the verdict, her voice was steady. The law was clear, the consequences unavoidable, the sentence firm. The woman didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She simply closed her eyes for a moment as if absorbing something inevitable, and then she looked up, at Eleanor. Not in anger, not in desperation, but with something like understanding. That look followed Eleanor long after the courtroom emptied. It followed her through the corridors of the courthouse, through the quiet of her chambers, through the drive home where the city lights blurred against the windshield. It irritated her. She had done nothing wrong. That night, Eleanor reviewed files she'd already signed off on. She reread statutes she could quote from memory. She told herself the feeling would pass. It always did. But when she closed her eyes, she saw the woman standing at the defense table, hands folded, spine straight, accepting a judgment that didn't fit the shape of the story. Eleanor slept poorly. The next morning, she arrived earlier than usual. She told herself it was coincidence when she asked her clerk for the case file again. She told herself it was professionalism when she reread the transcript. She told herself she was looking for errors. What she found instead were questions. Why hadn't the prosecutor mentioned the witness who disappeared before trial? Why had the police report omitted the call log timestamp? Why had the woman never tried to minimize her actions? Eleanor closed the file sharply. Judges didn't reopen cases on feelings. They didn't revisit verdicts because of looks exchanged across a courtroom. She pushed the file aside, but it didn't stay there. That afternoon, she passed the holding area on her way out, a route she rarely took. She stopped when she saw the woman sitting alone, hands resting calmly on her knees. Their eyes met again. This time the woman spoke first. "I understand why you ruled the way you did," she said quietly. Eleanor stiffened. "You shouldn't speak to me." "I know," she replied. "I just wanted you to know I don't blame you." Something inside Eleanor shifted. Not guilt, recognition. She walked away without responding. But the certainty she had built her life on, brick by brick, ruling by ruling, felt suddenly less solid. For the first time in years, Judge Eleanor Hawthorne wondered if justice, as she had practiced it, had room for truth, and that thought followed her into the dark.
Judge Eleanor Hawthorne had always believed that the law ended when the gavel fell. That was how she survived it. She left the courtroom behind her each evening the same way she entered it in the morning, composed, sealed, untouched. Verdicts stayed in files. Faces stayed in memory only long enough to be categorized and dismissed. This case refused to stay put. The woman's voice echoed in Eleanor's mind as she drove home, soft but unyielding. "I don't blame you." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't defiance. It was acceptance. And that disturbed Eleanor more than anger ever could. She arrived at her apartment after dark, the city humming below her windows. The place was immaculate, as always. No clutter, no reminders of a life lived outside the law. She poured herself a glass of water, ignored the untouched wine rack, and sat at the dining table without turning on the lights. For a long time, she did nothing. Then, against her better judgment, she opened her laptop. The case file was already bookmarked. She told herself she was reviewing procedure, ensuring there were no grounds for appeal, protecting the integrity of the court. But she read it like someone searching for something lost. The transcript was clean, too clean, every answer measured, every objection sustained or overruled with textbook precision. And yet, there it was again, the pause before the woman answered why. Eleanor replayed the audio from the hearing, listening closely through her headphones. She heard the intake of breath before the response, heard the weight behind the words. Because someone was going to die. Eleanor closed her eyes. Intent did not absolve action, that was the law. But intent mattered more than she had ever admitted, to juries, to colleagues, to herself. She scrolled further. Police reports, witness statements, a timeline that made sense until it didn't. A missing call log, an officer's body cam that cut out 30 seconds earlier than expected, a witness who was present but never testified. Eleanor straightened in her chair. Oversights happened. Judge Eleanor Hawthorne had always believed that the law ended when the gavel fell. That was how she survived it. She left the courtroom behind her each evening the same way she entered it in the morning, composed, sealed, untouched. Verdicts stayed in files. Faces stayed in memory only long enough to be categorized and dismissed. This case refused to stay put. The woman's voice echoed in Eleanor's mind as she drove home, soft but unyielding. I don't blame you. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't defiance. It was acceptance. And that disturbed Eleanor more than anger ever could. She arrived at her apartment after dark, the city humming below her windows. The place was immaculate, as always. No clutter, no reminders of a life lived outside the law. She poured herself a glass of water, ignored the untouched wine rack, and sat at the dining table without turning on the lights. For a long time, she did nothing. Then, against her better judgment, she opened her laptop. The case file was already bookmarked. She told herself she was reviewing procedure, ensuring there were no grounds for appeal, protecting the integrity of the court. But she read it like someone searching for something lost. The transcript was clean, too clean, every answer measured, every objection sustained or overruled with textbook precision. And yet, there it was again, the pause before the woman answered why. Eleanor replayed the audio from the hearing, listening closely through her headphones. She heard the intake of breath before the response, heard the weight behind the words. Because someone was going to die. Eleanor closed her eyes. Intent did not absolve action, that was the law. But intent mattered more than she had ever admitted, to juries, to colleagues, to herself. She scrolled further. Police reports, witness statements, a timeline that made sense until it didn't. A missing call log, an officer's body cam that cut out 30 seconds earlier than expected, a witness who was present but never testified. Eleanor straightened in her chair. Oversights happened, she knew that. No system was perfect, but this wasn't sloppiness, it was absence, clean absences, ones that suggested decisions had been made quietly, early, and without review. She shut the laptop with more force than necessary. This was not her role. Judges ruled on what was presented. They did not investigate. They did not chase hypotheticals because a defendant looked them in the eye a certain way. She went to bed angry, with herself. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it was restless, fragmented. Images of courtrooms and narrow streets bled together. The woman's face appeared again, not pleading, not accusing, simply there. Eleanor awoke before dawn. She dressed without thinking, choosing a dark suit she rarely wore, and arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. The halls were quiet, echoing with distant hum of cleaning crews and security checks. She passed the holding area again, empty. She felt an irrational flicker of disappointment. In her chambers, Eleanor sat at her desk and stared at the stack of files waiting for her attention. She picked up the top one, opened it, read the first line, then set it aside. Instead, she pressed the intercom. "Send in the clerk," she said. Minutes later, her clerk entered, young, capable, careful around Eleanor's silences. "Yes, Your Honor?" Eleanor folded her hands. "The case from yesterday afternoon, the interference charge." The clerk nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I want the full file, everything, including materials that weren't entered into evidence." The clerk hesitated. "That's usually unusual," she said carefully. Eleanor met her gaze. "Is it prohibited?" "No," the clerk admitted, "just not standard." "Neither is justice," Eleanor replied coolly. "Bring it." When the door closed, Eleanor exhaled slowly. She had crossed a line. Not a legal one, a personal one. The file arrived within an hour, thicker than the one she had reviewed before. Eleanor flipped through it methodically, her expression neutral even as her pulse quickened. There it was, a supplemental police report filed late, a notation about a third party who fled before officers arrived, a knife that was never recovered. Eleanor's jaw tightened. The narrative had been simplified, sanitized. She understood why. Cases like this clogged courts, complexity slowed sentencing, ambiguity made rulings vulnerable. Efficiency had won. But efficiency was not justice. That afternoon, Eleanor found herself lingering near the hallway that led to the holding cells again. She told herself she was heading to a meeting, that her path was coincidental. It wasn't. The woman was there, seated alone, posture as composed as she had been in court. When she looked up and saw Eleanor, surprise flickered briefly across her face, then calm. "Judge," she said respectfully. Eleanor stopped. She should have kept walking. She didn't. "Your attorney," Eleanor said, her voice measured, "didn't argue certain aspects of your case." The woman nodded. "I know." "Why not?" Eleanor asked. The woman considered the question. "Because the truth doesn't always sound convincing, especially when it doesn't fit the version people expect." Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. "You understood the risk." "Yes." "And you accepted the sentence." "Yes." "Why?" Eleanor pressed. The woman looked at her steadily. "Because I stepped in. Whatever the reason, the result was real. I don't regret it." Eleanor searched her face for calculation, for manipulation. She found none. "What's your name?" Eleanor asked. There was a beat of silence. "Marin. Lena Marin." Eleanor nodded once. "That will be all." She turned away before she could say more, before she could ask the question forming dangerously in her mind. "If I reopen this, will you trust me?" That evening, Eleanor sat alone in her chambers long after the courthouse emptied. She reviewed statutes governing judicial discretion. She reread precedents she had cited dozens of times before. There was a path forward, narrow, risky, controversial. It would require her to acknowledge that her original ruling, though lawful, might not have been just. Judges were not punished for being wrong, they were punished for being uncertain. Eleanor stared at the city through her window, the lights blurring softly as dusk settled in. For the first time in her career, she felt the weight of her authority not as protection but as responsibility, and for the first time she wondered whether her lifelong refusal to let emotion into her rulings had been a form of cowardice. The gavel had fallen, but the case was not finished. Not for her.
Judge Eleanor Hawthorne had always believed that doubt was a luxury, one the law could not afford. In her chambers, the shelves were lined with volumes she had trusted more than people: case law, statutes, precedent bound in leather and certainty. For years, those books had answered every question she allowed herself to ask. Now they felt incomplete. She sat at her desk long after the courthouse had emptied, the city outside her window dissolving into streaks of light as night settled in. The file lay open in front of her, Lena Myron's case, pages marked, annotated, weighed down by the quiet gravity of reconsideration. Eleanor had found the legal pathway. It existed, narrow, rarely used, and controversial. A judge could reopen a case if new material facts came to light, facts that could not reasonably have been presented during the original proceedings. It wasn't common, it wasn't encouraged, but it was lawful. The question wasn't, could she? It was, should she? She leaned back in her chair, fingers pressed together beneath her chin. Reopening the case would invite scrutiny. Appeals courts disliked unpredictability. Prosecutors would object. Colleagues would whisper. And Eleanor Hawthorne had built her reputation on never giving anyone reason to doubt her certainty. She closed the file. The next morning, she didn't reopen it. Instead, she went to court. The docket was full, the cases familiar. She ruled with the same calm authority she always had, her voice steady, her decisions precise. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. Each defendant who stood before her blurred into the next. Each argument echoed with an uncomfortable question she could no longer silence. Is this just or merely efficient? During a recess, Eleanor found herself standing near the holding area again. She hadn't planned to be there. Lena sat on the bench, hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked up when Eleanor approached, surprise flickering briefly across her face before settling into composed acceptance. "Judge," she said. Eleanor nodded. "Miss Myron." They stood in silence, the hum of the building pressing in around them. "Do you believe the law is fair?" Eleanor asked suddenly. Lena blinked, clearly caught off guard. She considered the question carefully before answering. "I believe the law is necessary. Fairness depends on who's holding it." Eleanor studied her face. "You're not angry." "No," Lena replied. "Anger assumes expectation. I knew the risk when I stepped in." "You could have walked away," Eleanor said. "Yes," Lena agreed, "but then I wouldn't be able to live with myself." Something in Eleanor's chest tightened. "You understand," Eleanor said slowly, "that reopening your case would not guarantee a different outcome." Lena nodded. "I know." "And it could make things worse," Eleanor added. "Yes." "Then why accept it?" Lena met her gaze steadily. "Because truth deserves the chance to be heard, even when it's inconvenient." Eleanor felt the words settle into her like a weight. That afternoon, Eleanor requested a private meeting with the prosecutor assigned to the case. It was an unusual move. Judges rarely initiated such conversations post-verdict. The prosecutor was polite but guarded. "You're considering reopening?" she asked, disbelief barely concealed. "I'm considering reviewing," Eleanor replied evenly. "The evidence was sufficient," the prosecutor said quickly. "The sentence lawful." "I'm aware, but the record was incomplete." The prosecutor frowned. "Incomplete doesn't mean incorrect." "No," Eleanor agreed, "but it means vulnerable." The conversation ended without resolution, without approval. Eleanor had expected that. What she hadn't expected was the quiet resistance from her peers. A colleague stopped her in the hallway. "You're not thinking of reopening that case, are you?" Eleanor met her gaze coolly. "I'm thinking." The judge shook her head. "You've built your career on clarity. Don't let one defendant blur it." That night, Eleanor sat alone in her apartment, the file open on her dining table. She stared at Lena's name. She didn't see a defendant anymore. She saw a woman who acted without calculation and accepted consequence without complaint. A woman who did what Eleanor herself had not done in years. Acted. Eleanor picked up her phone, then set it down. Judges didn't call defendants. They didn't reach across boundaries because of discomfort or admiration, but they could authorize procedural reviews. She drafted the order carefully. Neutral language, legal justification airtight, no emotion, no commentary. When she finished, she sat back, heart pounding, not from fear, but from recognition. She was choosing. The following morning, Eleanor stood before a different courtroom. This one smaller, closed, purpose-built for review hearings. Lena entered quietly, eyes widening slightly when she realized where she was. Eleanor took her seat. "This court has agreed to review new notarial evidence," Eleanor announced, her voice steady by the weight of the moment. The prosecutor objected. Procedural concerns were raised, precedents cited. Eleanor listened. Then she ruled. "The objections are noted. They are overruled." A murmur rippled through the room. Lena looked up, surprise flickering briefly across her face, then something else. Hope. Eleanor met her eyes. For the first time, she did not look away. Outside the courtroom, the backlash was immediate. Calls from colleagues, quiet warnings, a pointed conversation with the chief judge. "You're risking more than one case," he said. "I'm aware," Eleanor replied calmly. Why now? Eleanor hesitated. Because certainty without reflection becomes arrogance, and that's not justice. That evening, Eleanor returned to her chambers exhausted, drained, and strangely lighter. She hadn't fixed anything yet, but she had cracked open a door she had kept sealed for decades, and once opened, it refused to close. She stood by the window, the city glowing beneath her, and realized something that unsettled her more than any appeal or criticism ever could. She didn't regret the decision, not a little. The law still mattered, but it no longer felt complete on its own, and neither did she. The courthouse had never felt so loud. Judge Eleanor Hawthorne could hear it before she entered, the murmur of voices gathering like a storm just beneath the ceiling. Clerks moved faster than usual. Security stood straighter. Even the walls seemed alert, as if the building itself understood that something rare was about to happen. Word had spread. A review hearing. A reopened case. Her case. Eleanor walked down the corridor in her robe, posture unchanged, expression composed. From the outside, she looked exactly as she always had, controlled, certain, immovable. Inside, every step carried weight. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows. Legal observers sat with notebooks already open. Attorneys whispered behind raised hands. This wasn't just about Lena Marin anymore. It was about Eleanor. She took her seat. All rise. The room obeyed. When she looked up, Lena was already standing at the defense table. She looked different today. Not weaker. If anything, steadier. Her eyes met Eleanor's briefly, a flicker of acknowledgement passing between them. No gratitude, no expectation, just presence. The prosecutor began immediately, tone sharpened by pressure, objections layered over one another, precedents cited, warnings delivered thinly veiled as arguments. This court risks undermining the finality of its own judgments, the prosecutor said. If verdicts can be revisited because a judge feels discomfort, the system becomes unstable. Eleanor listened without interruption. When it was her turn to speak, the courtroom leaned forward. This review is not based on feeling, Eleanor said calmly. It is based on material omissions that affect the integrity of the original ruling. She outlined them precisely: the missing call log, the absent witness, the unrecovered weapon. Each fact landed cleanly, unmistakably. The room shifted. Lena was called to speak again. She stepped forward without hesitation. I don't want special treatment. I just want the truth to be complete. The simplicity of the statement cut through the tension like a blade. Eleanor watched her carefully. There was no performance here, no attempt to persuade, just honesty. When the arguments concluded, Eleanor called a recess. The room erupted the moment she left the bench. In her chambers, Eleanor stood by the window, hands clasped behind her back. Her reflection stared back at her. Older, yes, but clearer than it had been in years. She thought of her career, the respect she had earned, the certainty she had wielded like armor. She thought of Lena, standing alone, accepting consequence without resentment. Eleanor returned to the bench. The courtroom fell silent instantly. This court has reviewed the newly presented evidence. It finds that the prior record did not fully reflect the circumstances of the incident. A breath was held somewhere in the room. Accordingly, the prior sentence is vacated. The words rippled outward. Lena's eyes widened just slightly. Gasps followed, murmurs, pens scratched furiously. This court finds that the defendant's actions, while unlawful under statute, were undertaken to prevent imminent harm. Eleanor continued. Sentencing will reflect that reality. She delivered the new ruling with the same steady authority she had always used. Probation, community service, no incarceration. The gavel struck. It sounded different this time. When court adjourned, chaos followed. Reporters surged, questions flew, commentary spread faster than Eleanor could escape it. By afternoon, headlines were already forming. Strict judge reverses own ruling. Courtroom drama sparks debate on judicial discretion. Colleagues avoided her gaze in the hallways. Some offered curt nods. Others said nothing at all. The chief judge called her into his office before the day ended. "You knew this would happen," he said. "Yes," Eleanor replied. "You've invited scrutiny." "I invited accountability," she corrected. He studied her for a long moment. "You've changed." Eleanor met his gaze. "So has the world." That evening, she returned to her chambers long after the courthouse emptied. The building felt different now, less reverent, more human. She was gathering her things when she heard a knock. Lena stood in the doorway. "I was told you could find you here," she said quietly. Eleanor nodded. "You shouldn't linger, the press." "I'm not here for them," Lena replied. They stood facing each other in the quiet room, the space between them charged but restrained. "Thank you," Lena said, finally. Eleanor shook her head. This wasn't kindness, it was correction. Lena considered that. "It still cost you something." "Yes," Eleanor admitted. "Why?" Lena asked. The question was gentle, honest. Eleanor took a breath. "Because I realized I'd been confusing certainty with justice." Silence settled between them. "I don't know what happens next for either of us," Lena said. Eleanor nodded. "Neither do I." They shared a look then, one that held no hierarchy, no judgment, just recognition. For the first time, Eleanor felt the weight of her robe not as authority, but as something she could choose to set aside. Outside, the city buzzed with debate. Opinions clashed. Reputations shifted. Inside that quiet chamber, something else had changed. Not the law, but the women standing on either side of it. The silence after the verdict was louder than the courtroom had ever been. For weeks, Judge Eleanor Hawthorne had lived inside noise, arguments, objections, criticism disguised as concern. Now, in the early hours of a Sunday morning, her apartment was quiet enough to hear the city breathing below. She sat at the dining table without turning on the lights, a mug cooling untouched between her hands. The headlines had slowed, not stopped, just softened. Controversial ruling sparks debate. Judge accused of overreach. Justice or judicial activism? Eleanor read none of them anymore. She had already paid the price she cared about. Colleagues treated her differently now, some with cautious respect, others with polite distance. Invitations to private discussions stopped arriving. Decisions were second-guessed more openly. Her authority, once unquestioned, now came with a pause. She welcomed it. For the first time in her career, Eleanor felt honest. The court moved on quickly, it always did. New cases replaced old ones. New defendants stood where Lena once had. Eleanor ruled with the same care, but not the same rigidity. She listened longer. She asked more questions. She acknowledged uncertainty when it mattered. And she slept better than she had in years. Lena Marin did not disappear from Eleanor's thoughts. Not obsessively, not romantically, at least not at first. It was subtler than that. Lena had become a reference point, a reminder of what happened when truth arrived quietly instead of demanding attention. They didn't see each other for several weeks. That was intentional. Judges did not form relationships with people whose lives they had altered so directly. Boundaries mattered. Eleanor respected them too much to pretend otherwise. But boundaries did not erase impact. One evening, Eleanor found herself walking through a neighborhood she rarely visited. Smaller streets, fewer lights, a bookstore she hadn't noticed before. She stopped. Inside, Lena stood at the counter speaking softly to the clerk. She looked different, perhaps lighter, less braced. When she turned and saw Eleanor, surprise flickered briefly across her face. Then warmth. "Judge," she said automatically, then stopped herself. "Eleanor." Eleanor nodded. "Lena." They stood there, unsure, the weight of everything unspoken hovering between them. "How are you?" Eleanor asked. Lena smiled faintly, learning how to breathe again. Eleanor felt something ease in her chest. They didn't talk about the case, they didn't need to. They talked about books, about quiet things, about how strange it felt to have time without fear pressing against it. When they parted, it was without promises, without expectation, just openness. They began to meet occasionally after that, always in public, always careful. Coffee shops, walks through the city at dusk, conversations that wandered gently, touching past pain only when invited. Eleanor never offered advice. Lena never asked for favors. They met as equals. It was in those moments, unstructured, unscripted, that Eleanor began to understand what she had been missing. Not intimacy, presence. Years of authority had taught her how to command a room. They had not taught her how to sit quietly with another human being and simply exist. Lena did. One evening, months later, they stood on a pedestrian bridge overlooking the river. The city lights reflected in the water below, fractured but beautiful. "Do you ever regret it?" Lena asked quietly. Eleanor knew what she meant. "No," she said. "Do you?" Lena shook her head. Not once. They leaned against the railing side by side, close but not touching. "People keep asking me if I think you were brave," Lena continued. "I don't think that's the right word." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "What is?" "Honest," Lena replied. "You stopped hiding behind certainty." Eleanor exhaled slowly. "It took someone standing in front of me without fear to make me realize how afraid I was." Lena turned to her. "Afraid of what?" "Of being wrong," Eleanor said. "Of being human." Lena smiled gently. "We're all wrong eventually." The simplicity of it struck Eleanor harder than any legal argument ever had. Their connection deepened, not quickly, not recklessly. It grew in the spaces between conversations, in the way Eleanor began to laugh more freely, in the way Lena no longer watched exits when she entered rooms. There was no dramatic confession, no line crossed in haste, just a moment, one evening, when Eleanor reached for Lena's hand and Lena let her. It wasn't a claim, it was permission. Eleanor's career did not end, it changed. She became known as a judge who listened, who questioned completeness, who understood that law was not weakened by reflection. Some disagreed, some always would. She accepted that. Lena rebuilt her life slowly. She found work that mattered to her. She spoke at community forums, not as a symbol, but as a person who understood consequence and choice. They protected each other's independence fiercely. What they shared was not rescue. It was recognition. One night, much later, Eleanor stood alone in her chambers after another long day. She removed her robe carefully and hung it on the hook by the door. For the first time, she didn't feel defined by it. She looked at her reflection in the window, older, softer, truer. The question that had once terrified her no longer did. Who judges the judge? She knew the answer now. Conscience, truth, and the quiet courage to listen when certainty begins to crack. And sometimes, a woman who stands before you unafraid and reminds you that justice is not a rule, it's a responsibility.